Okay.
Dr. Carolyn Ross, welcome to the show. What's going on?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, Jimmy,
Oh,
to talk about our favorite subject for both of us.
yes. I always love talking to people who have passion for what they do. And when you reached out to me, you're like, hey, you've been talking about some of your childhood trauma stuff. I've got a little bit of experience with that, both personally and professionally. I'd love to come on your show and talk about it. And when I started looking at work, I'm like, wow, like we need more people like you articulating this part of health that nobody ever really talks about.
I know it's a well-kept secret.
Yeah,
The T word is a well-kept
yeah.
secret. Trauma.
T word or the SA word.
Yeah, that.
Any of the EA word, any of those things. So I want to tell people about who you are. So the underscore anchor underscore program, and that's your program, anchorprogram.com. It's a non-diet program for helping people with food and body image issues and some of the things we're going to talk about here today regarding childhood trauma. Let's just dive right in, though, because it seems to me when you talk about childhood trauma, the first thing that people who have not been through trauma say is, oh, that's in the past. Why can't you just let go of the past? It happened. Okay, great. Oh, you had a few boohoo moments. Oh, poor you. Just move on with your life. Can you talk about why that's kind of heartless?
Well, two things. First of all, many people who are trauma survivors themselves want to leave things in the past, and they don't really understand how trauma affects us and how that effect can not only follow us into our adult life, but actually follow us into generations to come. And so I think if you just know a tiny bit about the effect of trauma on the brain, especially childhood trauma, which not only changes, when an adult is traumatized, it changes their behaviors. They may start drinking, they may start overeating, all of that. But when a child under the age of 18 is traumatized, it actually changes the architecture of the brain. So it changes the brain's hard wiring.
Yes.
So the way in which, nerve cells are connected are changed. And so it's not something where you can just go on with your life, because it changes how you pay attention to things. It changes how you deal with stress. It changes your reactivity to new events or to difficult events. So it's all of those. And by the time a child who's been traumatized gets to be an adult, they've been experiencing these effects throughout their lives. So just think about a kid like a boy who was traumatized, and then he starts acting out in school, and he's sent to the principal's office over and over. And then this leads to more acting out, maybe with drugs and alcohol. And then maybe he drops out of school. And by the time he's, 30 or something, his whole life has been affected by that original trauma.
Yeah, when I've talked to experts on childhood trauma, right after I got back from my sabbatical, I had all these experts on talking about childhood trauma, then COVID hit and all the everything else. So kind of got sidetracked off of that with other things. But a lot of those experts say that once you have one trauma happen, and sometimes we think of trauma as kind of an event, but the trauma continues on.
Lives in the body.
Exactly. That experience of the initial event that led to the trauma, then led to more trauma, then led to more trauma. And it's almost like you're setting yourself up as dominoes to have trauma the rest of your life because of that initial trauma. One of the people I interviewed, she talked about her dad dying like suddenly in a car accident. And it sent her into a tailspin where she got into drugs and then got into sex and then got into everything you can imagine. And it wasn't until she noticed, oh my gosh, I'm in trauma now. That my dad dying was not the trauma. I'm in trauma now, that she was able to pluck herself out of that.
Yeah, well, in my TEDx talk that I gave this actually in January, that very same story happened to my brother. So my brother, who's, 13 months younger than our dad died when he was, 16 or 17. Oh. And that threw him in. He's the oldest boy, so he tried to step into my dad's shoes. and it was too much. And that led to a lifelong addiction to heroin and, multiple medical problems, jail time, all of it. And, we are a middle-class family, so it's not like we grew up in poverty and we had a lot of other challenges, but that one event was the one that set him off and then led to multiple other traumatic events.
So helping people at that moment of the event itself, that seems to be kind of the flashpoint where we could stop some of the cascade of inevitability later in life. How do you get those people in treatment, in whatever? Like, what's the step? How do you make that happen?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And I think the Adverse Childhood Experiences study has been starting to address that, as well as addressing the intergenerational effects of trauma. And, their goal, of course, is prevention. And obviously, if you can build communities where children can be safe and secure and nurtured, that's the best case scenario. But second to that, I've seen that there are a number of schools now that are taking on identifying children who have had trauma. Even during the opiate epidemic, there are schools in the Northeast, I think, that have been hard hit, where kids are coming to school without food, haven't had clean clothes or anything, and those teachers are taking on trying to help steer the children through the trauma. And so I think as early as we can get it, even just, if you're a grandparent, I've talked to a lot of people where their grandchildren are going through something and they don't know how to help. Even as a grandchild, all a child needs is one person that they feel safe and secure and nurtured by. Even if they've been traumatized, that rootedness with one person can help build resilience and help them weather the effects of their trauma.
And getting into the intergenerational aspect of this, I mean, I've told my story very openly, as have others, where I was abused by my father, who was abused by his father, and God knows what happened to my grandfather. If he was abused, I assume he probably was in some way. And they try to excuse it with each new generation. So my grandfather, who I never knew, was an alcoholic, along with being physically abusive, emotionally abusive to his whole family, including my grandmother. Then my dad, who experienced all that, then abused me only physically and emotionally, and didn't drink alcohol. So maybe in his mind, well,
he's doing a lot better. Yeah.
My dad, what's that?
He's doing a lot better, he thinks. Yeah, exactly.
And so I have yet to have kids in my life. I still want to have them someday. And I'm thinking that, okay, a step up from that, had I had kids earlier in my life, I would have probably only screamed at them and emotionally berated them instead of hitting them. Oh, I was better than my dad. And sometimes it doesn't even incremental like that. Sometimes the exact same abuse happens generation, generation, if not goes worse with one generation. Again, that hard wiring you were just talking about, that, oh, you learn the way you discipline is you hit.
Right.
That becomes hardwired. And so they then pass that on to their kids, and it just never stops.
Or the way you deal with stress is just to suck it up, So that's what you were taught. So never learn to express your feelings, never learn to deal with, never even learn to identify your feelings. You were just trained to suck it up. And that's how you taught your kids and their kids,
My dad was a cop growing up.
Oh, wow.
Typical, prototypical cop. Very stern face. You never smiled. You never laughed. You just were stern all the time. And meanwhile, I'm a very emotional being. Like, I recognized early on, I'm not my dad.
Yeah.
Very emotional. And I could see I was different than that. But he was trying to fit me within the box of what he wanted me to be like him. And I was being my own person. And I think that's where we had a little bit of the conflict, where some of the abuse started happening to me, because I wasn't fitting his mode of what he thought a man should be.
Right.
And so that's a lot of the challenge of this as well is, and I know, and it's not just me, I'm just using my life as an example because it exemplifies it, but I know people in my life right now where the mom, for example, was heavily abused, emotionally berated when they were a kid. And now they have kids and they have no idea they're doing the exact same thing to the kids. And the kids are just kind of, you can see they're rebelling against that kind of demand for being like her when they don't want to be like her at all. Probably much in the same way as she didn't want to be like her mom, who was emotionally berating her. So it's like there needs to be an understanding of the individuality of people, and even within your own family. I hope someday, if I am blessed with kids, that they don't be like me. That I hope they forge their own way apart from being a mini version of Jimmy Moore.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult if you are the person who has been abused. You are seeing life through those colored glasses, and everything looks a certain way to you. Whereas, had you not been abused, it would look a completely different way. And so I think that explains why some people don't recognize that they're repeating the same patterns over and over, or don't even feel that the trauma had any impact on them.
Mm-hmm.
I've treated a lot of patients with eating disorders. One I remember in particular who was sexually abused by her own pediatrician. But when she came into treatment, she said, "Oh, that was years ago. That was 15 years ago. That has nothing to do with what I'm going through now." And it was like, well, but it does. It definitely does. So,
Yeah, it's amazing to me how we want to pretend like the past didn't happen.
yeah.
And what I have found, and again, I'll go back to my own experience just because I have that at the top of my head. My dad to this day still won't recognize what he did to me. And when I started talking more openly in podcasts and online on my Jimmy Ranch show all about the childhood trauma, he immediately called my mom out of the blue, had not talked to her in 12 years. They've been divorced forever, but had not talked to her in forever, in 12 years. And suddenly, oh, something's wrong with Jimmy. He says I abused him. I didn't do that. He felt like he had to defend himself. And
Yeah.
it's like, you're telling everybody you did this by so quickly jumping to trying to defend yourself.
It's a hard pill to swallow, to know that you suffered as a child and then you made your own children suffer. I mean, I think as a parent, it's hard to admit that you've made any mistakes with your children,
Yeah.
but certainly to pass on a pattern of abuse that you experienced yourself, it's a hard pill to swallow, and it's heartbreaking, I think, in a way.
Well, and I think as a victim of that, I just want him to show contrition, show that, okay, yeah, I messed up. Like, here's the scenario. Jimmy, I'm so sorry that you had a rough childhood, and a lot of it was because of me, and I was dealing with my own childhood trauma demons. That my dad, he was ruthless. I would see him throw my mom, my grandmother, up against the wall, and then he'd come and punch me and my brother, and it was rough for me, and I didn't know how to handle when I had a kid at 17 and then another one, me, at 21, that how you're supposed to interact with them was to be a little more gentle. And I know I said things in a much harsher way than I should have. And I did things to you physically that, looking back in hindsight, oh my gosh, I would never do that consciously. Will you please forgive me, because I really didn't know I was doing that. Like, if he showed.
But if you listen to yourself, yeah, if you listen to yourself, what you are saying takes a lot higher level of consciousness than many people have.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you've taken your experiences and you've evolved because of it.
Right.
And your consciousness has, evolved with you. But for most people, not everybody has that level of consciousness and that level of awareness, or, Jimmy, the courage to admit that they're wrong. Because it takes a lot of courage to say, yeah, I did something to someone that I should have been taken care of, that I should have loved with all that I had, that I should have protected. but I was the one who perpetrated on them. That takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, and he's towards the end of his life now. That's the odd thing. He's very, very, very frail, probably because of the hard life he had as a kid that was traumatizing, and he's lived with that trauma his whole life, and then traumatized me and my older brother, who's now deceased. And so the funny thing about he was selective with who he traumatized. My younger brother Nathan, he never yelled at, he never hit.
Mm-hmm.
So on a conscious level, it seemed he could differentiate between me and my brother Kevin and my younger brother Nathan. Is that a consciousness, or is that a subconscious of we remind him of something? Like, what would make him be selective?
Yeah, sometimes it is that you remind him of yourself, of himself, maybe, or that there's something about the younger child that allowed him to soften. I don't know. Or sometimes they do realize that they've been too hard and they want to make amends by raising their last child in a different way. So there's no way to know. I think most people who have had trauma as a child never come to terms with it. You know, it's unusual for people to do the hard work that it takes to come to terms with trauma and to heal from it.
I can tell you, I'm 48 years old now, and just now at this point in my life, feeling more at peace about what happened, only because I have a new perspective about it. Like you were talking about how you're hardwired when you're in those, delicate years growing up. And I know from 14 to 17, becoming an adult, that I had a hard wiring. But I wonder if what was meant for ill intention indirectly made me into kind of the qualities that I have in my life now. Like, I'm a very hard worker now. I'm also very determined to prove people wrong now, because I was always told you're never going to amount to anything. Would I have achieved the success that I've had but for that hard wiring of telling me I was no good, and the emotional abuse and the physical abuse reinforcing that? I just, I have a new perspective about this that I never thought about in my whole life. Always lament what did happen rather than celebrate what did happen and how I became Jimmy Moore, that people know me as today, because of that.
Absolutely. And true healing has that effect. Some time ago, I interviewed cancer survivors, and most of them said that if you have cancer and you live long enough, you'll see cancer as a gift. And I think the same thing with trauma. It can be transformational in your life if you go through the healing process. And you get to that point where you realize this is all part of who I am. It's not separate from me, and has contributed to some of the good things about me. So, but I think you have to go through that process to get there. You can't jump to, oh, well, my trauma was really great for me. No, you have to go through the dark night of the soul, and before you can get that benefit, that gift, really, that comes back.
Yeah, I focus in when I tell my story of the 14 to 17 and a half, and then I went off to college as that kind of focal point, because that's when the abuse happened. But really, if I go back, my parents divorced when I was 1.5. Then they remarried, and then the turmoil of mixed, marriages and kids and this. And then my mom had a daughter, and my dad had a son, and then they both divorced those and went to another. So I had trauma long before I had the trauma.
Yeah, a lot of chaos there. And as you know, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which has illuminated this whole issue so clearly, is that it increases your risk not just for addictions and eating disorders, but for, health conditions like heart disease and diabetes and obesity and all of that. So I think as we come to accept this role that trauma plays in our health, I think it'll be a lot easier in some ways for people to get the help that they need.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's still stigmatized as psychology rather than physiology, and yet the psychology is impacting the physiology.
Well, it's not even still there anymore, because epigenetics has shown that your DNA, even though your DNA doesn't change, the expression of your genes is changed by trauma. And they are actually finding, chemical markers on the genes that have been changed. And these chemical markers then being passed from one generation to another to another. So now we know it is physiology. It's not psychology. It's in our genes. And I think that's going to make a shift for, how, whether there's acceptance or not, hopefully.
Well, and I think more cognition and recognition of insulin resistance kind of generally in our culture, which is manifesting as type 2 diabetes and heart disease and Alzheimer's and all the other things, all the other chronic diseases, they're all insulin resistance. And I think when we look at food patterns, we look at movement patterns, we look at other things, this is going to be an element of that will come into the clinical kind of diagnosing of all of this, because it has to be. Like, it's too prevalent for us not to look at the monkey in the room that's been ignored and see that people that are eating right, they're doing all the right things, they're still dealing with insulin resistance. There's got to be a trigger there, and that trigger could be the T word.
The T word, which causes our stress response to be out of whack, which causes the production of cortisol, which affects our risk for depression and for inflammation. So all of those are physiological patterns that happen out of the T word. So I think, medicine is hard to change. It takes about, they say, I think 17 to 20 years for medical science to kind of move in the right direction. If you remember when we talked about things like smoking cessation, it was doctors were advertising smoking on TV for a long time, when I was a kid. Right. And so it took 20 years for medicine to finally admit, no, we were wrong. Smoking is not good for your health, no matter whether you're smoking menthols or not. You shouldn't be smoking.
Some of those vintage commercials on YouTube, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like now I see, like if we did that like 20 years from now when sugar is going to be kind of on the outs, oh, eat sugar because it'll cure your hunger. We will all kind of go, what? Like, what were they thinking?
I know. They'll be looking at those cereal commercials that, that try to sell the kids and thinking, you're trying to kill your kids.
It's a good source of vitamin D. I'm like, no, the sun is a good source of vitamin D.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's a lot of change that needs to happen. And I think particularly in the arena related to some of the stigmatized conditions, such as, addictions and eating disorders, because right now those are a source of huge stigma. And the stigma just makes things a lot worse. So if they can be brought into a scientific arena where we can show, hey, this happens, that happens, that happens. I mean, you and I know so many people who are, trying to get well from an addiction or trying to get well from an eating disorder. And they're, like you said, they're doing all the right things. And yet, things aren't, it's just really, really difficult for them. So I hope that in the future, we will take this in a different light.
Yeah, and I think we will. And of course, when you start talking eating addictions, people immediately go to anorexia and bulimia, but almost everybody forgets about binge eating. And I can tell you, when I got out of the house and got out of the abuse, I could not go to college fast enough. Yeah. Like, amazingly, I was still excelling at a very high academic level, despite the abuse, despite the emotional turmoil in my head all the time. I still got all A's and B's, enough to go to college. And so I was in college, and I was still going, what the bleep just happened in my life? Like, I was processing. And it was probably from the age of 17 until about 32 before I came to a reckoning of just starting to think about, okay, this is what happened. It took that long for me to binge, just to cover up the pain, and always looking over my shoulder thinking my dad was coming after me, because I had that real primal fear within me that he was coming to kill me.
A feeling of not being safe.
Not safe at all.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, I think, Gabor Mate, he's a Canadian addictionologist, and he defines trauma as a loss of a sense of safety, trust, and vitality.
Mm.
He doesn't define it as an event. He defines it as the effect of the event is that loss of a sense of safety. And you carry that with you into adulthood. And even when you may be safe, some small event could happen that'll trigger that feeling of unsafety. Someone may say something or bump you in a line, or, any kind of thing can trigger that. So I think it's really important that you were able to recognize and get that help that you need.
Well, and the funny part is, you mentioned bumping into people and getting agitated. I did that.
Yeah.
Like, I would get so angry, and I couldn't figure out, why was I so angry? I'm a happy guy in general, but I was always so angry. I literally could never put my finger on, between 17 and 32, why I was that way. I feel like I lost my 20s totally, because it was just this blur of one bad thing after another that happened in my life, because I'm sitting there still in this fear over what had happened to me as a teenager.
Exactly. And you mentioned binge eating disorder, and my anchor program is focused on people with binge eating disorder, which is there are more people in that category than in anorexia and bulimia combined. But like you say, anorexia and bulimia are the ones that get all the press. But I think binge eating disorder also, has a strong relationship to trauma, to the T word. So
I can tell you, I was never tempted to do like drugs. No. Alcohol, no. I had a Judeo-Christian background growing up, and I was kind of hammered into me, don't drink. So
yeah.
what was left? Sugar, grains, junk food, fast food, and I ate it like there was no tomorrow. It got to the point, at one point, a lot of people know my story, where I was drinking 16 cans of Coca-Cola a day. I would eat 16 cans, yeah. Whole boxes of Little Debbie snack cakes, 2 of those every day. I would go to McDonald's, and then I would eat that on the way to work, and I would stop at the 7-Eleven. I'd get a double gulp and a honey bun and a chocolate chip cookie, and I would eat that at my desk when I got to work. Then I'd get to work, and I'd eat out of the I was constantly eating to soothe pain. And again, on a conscious level, no idea what I was doing. I
think that's really common. I talk to people every week who do not really understand that link between what happened to them as children and what's going on with them today. Oftentimes we say to our families, will say, well, what's wrong with you? Like, Jimmy, why couldn't you be more like your younger brother? Or why couldn't you be more like your dad, or whatever? And it's really the question that we should be asking is, what happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you get here from, your birth to where you are now, struggling with whatever you're struggling with? What happened to you? And then how can we help? Like, how can we go with that understanding of what happened and how it affected you? Because that's what's going to inform how we can help you. If we leave that out, then it's all just monkey juice. So it's the diets, one after another, thinking that those will fix you. Or if I could just stay thin, then maybe my life would turn out better. I would get the husband I want. I would get the career I want, etc. And then you find out when you're 40 or 50 or 60 that you did all that and it did not work because it was the wrong focus. Instead of focusing on the trauma, you focused on your body size, and that never changes anything.
And I can tell you, the kindness and compassion and selflessness that it takes for an individual to ask, what did you go through? In light of what most people have gone through, some stuff on varying levels, obviously, varying levels of severity. Like, I didn't go through something. Some inner city kids have had to watch like their own parents get murdered and other things like that. That's a hugely traumatic thing, but it's still trauma, the same as mine was trauma, the same as the kid who just gets yelled at is trauma.
Yeah, because it's individual. Some things are harder for some people than others. Some people are born with more resilience, or they have someone in their family. Like I know Oprah Winfrey talked about having a teacher in third grade or something that helped her. Like I said, you only need one person. So sometimes people get lucky and they have that one person. For me, it was my grandmother. And so I had that person who always gave me unconditional love and supported me and so on. And if you have that, or you are born with more resilience, then you can get through a lot more. Like, what I realized for myself, I'm the oldest of five. So I was, I was raising my siblings from the age of 9 on. I was the little mother because my mom had so many problems, and I just realized that I learned over the years how to shut out all of the, pain that I was having so that I could take care of other people. And then I went into medicine and did the same darn thing. Rather than focusing on healing my own trauma, I kept taking care of people, and that was my sugar. That was my distraction from the pain, is to focus on other people.
Can I tell you the workaholic thing? I never realized why I worked so friggin' hard and that it was a coping mechanism for the trauma until this year when I interviewed a few people, and like 3 or 4 different people, and now you've said it. They all say, "Oh yeah, if you're a hard worker, if you're a perfectionist,
Yes.
coping mechanism, if your type A personality is coping mechanism because you had trauma." And I'm going, "Oh my gosh!" Like I never thought. Like
High five on that one.
Yeah, it's a good value to have people see you as a virtuous thing. Oh, you're a hard worker. You put in a good hard day's work and blah, blah, blah. And I'm a workaholic still, but I've learned to temper it back. I work now not because I feel like I have to prove anything, but because I want to. I work
Because
hard.
I love my work now. Yeah, exactly. But I think, I got burnt. I went into burnout when I was in my late 40s because of that. I just couldn't do it anymore at that level that I was doing it, trying to prove to everybody that I was okay, and that I could handle everything, handle my parents, handle my brother with his addiction, and, all this other stuff going on in my family. And I just couldn't do it. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people when they don't address their own trauma, and they, and they're workaholics particularly. that's a recipe for disaster: workaholism and trauma.
So you mentioned earlier you did a TEDx talk earlier this year. Where was that?
The TEDx talk was in Pleasant Grove, Texas.
Okay.
And yeah, I talked about intergenerational and historical trauma, and I talked about my own personal history with seeing trauma being passed down through the generations, and like you, wanting to interrupt that cycle, like, seeing my family tree, and in every generation some wonderful child got lost because of mental illness or addiction or some other, you know result of trauma, and of intergenerational trauma. And so, it was been very sobering for me to just look at my family from that bird's eye view. And it's heartbreaking when you see children who are so gifted and sensitive, like you were saying about yourself. A lot of them are very much, sensitive kids, and then they end up homeless on the street with mental illness, or, like my brother with heroin addiction. So he was another sensitive soul with a big heart who died a few years ago now, but just a wonderful human being. Like, people who came to his funeral said he would give you the shirt off of his back, and that's how he was.
Yeah.
And yet he was plagued most of his life with addiction.
Mm.
Yeah.
I do often wonder if I grew up in a loving home where I was supported, where my dreams and thoughts and ideas were encouraged, and maybe I would got straight A's. How would my life have been different? It's kind of a fun thought game, but it's
Yeah. Well,
that's
it's
what happened.
it's an important thought, because what trauma does is hijack your potential in life. So you take a baby, a newborn baby, that baby has a certain potential based on their genetics, and then their environment, like you say, and so on. But what trauma does is hijack that child's potential. And sometimes they can still, like if they're overachievers like you and me, they can still do okay. But I still don't feel like I've lived up to my potential, honestly. Yeah. And so, I think, and certainly other members of my family, I feel, have struggled even more than I have, a lot more, and have their potential is hijacked. So you're right. I mean, what it takes to nurture a child, we know that now, but our parents aren't learning that. They aren't being taught. The schools are overwhelmed. A lot of the problems aren't being addressed, and so that potential does get hijacked.
Yeah, and unfortunately, those people just become a part of society without the context of how they got to be that way in society. And
That's such a good statement. Yeah.
And they're judged, and they're sometimes they go into criminal behavior because of some of those things, and so then they're labeled a thug, a prisoner, or whatever, and so then this follows them around. It's almost as if the tentacles of trauma release a million different other tentacles into every aspect of the rest of your life.
That's an exact description, because particularly if you end up in the legal system.
Yes.
Like my brother was in federal prison for 9 years. Now he came out, he was clean and sober, but he couldn't find any work. And one of his biggest values was supporting his family. So what do you do with that? We have so many people who have been picked up for small offenses and convicted, for having an addiction, for example. If you look at what's happened in Portugal, for example, it's very instructive when they started changing addiction from a legal problem to a mental health or behavioral health problem and sending people to rehab. Their overdose rates went down dramatically. Their prison sentences went down dramatically. The lifespan of these people increased dramatically. That's not to say that they didn't have some people who just could never, finally heal. But overall, as a country, they really turned that problem around. And it's a real good model that we need to follow, I think.
I need to look that up because I had not heard about Portugal doing that. That's amazing. That's awesome. Yes. Tell me about why you got into this arena as a medical doctor. You're not hearing a lot of medical doctors unless you're specializing, I guess, as a sub practice in eating disorders and addictions and things like that. What got you into this besides your own personal story?
Well, I think a lot of it is my personal story. I've always been interested in, I think from an early stage in my career, I had the question, what makes people heal? And I kept digging and digging and digging. And I know it's a weird thing to say, but rather than I didn't believe that everything I learned in medical school was the answer to everything I saw.
What?
I know, right? It's so true. But so when I started seeing people coming in with problems I couldn't fix, then I started asking more questions. And I remember just simple things like a woman who came to me and she had stomach pain. And I did all the medical testing. And then I finally just said to her, well, what's going on in your life? And then she broke down crying. And the bottom line was she couldn't stomach something that was going on in her marriage. Mm. And that was when the light bulb went off. And I thought, oh, my goodness, there's more going on here than the body, And that became my interest. And I think addictions and eating disorders are exemplary of that need to focus on body, mind, and spirit in healing. And so I think that's part of what drew me to them. My grandfather was also a doctor, my mother's father. And his mother was like a medicine woman, Cherokee medicine woman. And so he was taught from an early age to look at the environment and other factors. And I think that was passed along to me. I've always been interested in, in body, mind, spirit stuff. So I think that's the main thing. And then my family history really put a cap on it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of medical doctors get into keto, for example, which is my arena, low carb diets, because they hear patients come in, hey, I read this diet book called Keto Clarity and it's working for me. Can you help guide me? And they're like, well, what's that? And then they learn. And so that kind of gets them in, and or they have obesity and type 2 diabetes and other things that they try to manage with that. And so that's really neat. And I'm not hearing a lot of people out there that are MDs doing this. Are you unique, or are there others like you?
I don't think there's so many who work with both eating disorders and addictions. There's medical specialties in addictions, like addiction psychiatry, for example. I'm an addictionologist, so I come from a primary care background. But I've always worked with women primarily in my practices, so I've always had to deal with eating disorders and, things like that. So I've come to believe that unless you deal with the trauma, there's really no way to address the health issues.
Yeah.
And I really believe you can be healthy, no matter what your size is, that the focus should be really on health, not on size,
I've heard that somewhere. Yes.
Yes, I'm sure you have. You probably interviewed the person who said it first.
Well, I believe in it because obviously being a very public figure online, I get a lot of hate just because of my size. And I keep trying to remind people aren't everything they seem on the outside. And I started talking about the childhood trauma, and people are like, well, you can't use that as an excuse why you're still big today. And I'm like,
Wow. Okay.
yeah, I can actually, because it impacted me in ways that you can't even imagine.
Yeah.
It impacted me. And I think we need to have a lot more grace and compassion for people wherever they are in their journey. If they're pursuing health, they should be celebrated and not discouraged.
Yeah, because we're all a work in progress. And it's sad to say, but I think the online space is a very mean-spirited space many times. And I've been trolled online, just like what you're talking about. Gotten a lot of hate coming my way too. And I think I'm with you. I think compassion is what heals. I don't think calling people out without knowing their story, or even if you know it and you're judging them, it's sad to me. I find it very sad and hurtful.
It is sad, but that's why I stay engaged, because people need a happy, positive face out there. And I take some arrows, but I get a lot of loving back from people that appreciate the work that I do. And I know they appreciate the work that you do as well. By the way, her website, you guys, CarolynRossMD.com. And again, _anchor_ program over on Instagram. Is that where you're active the most, is Instagram, or where?
I'm active on Instagram and on Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where people can reach me. The Anchor program has its own website, anchorprogram.com,
Yes.
which you mentioned before. And I also have 3 books, one on emotional eating. This is my trilogy, Jimmy.
That's great.
Emotional eating, binge eating, and then food addiction. Those are my 3 babies that I have. And they're all workbooks, and they give people the opportunity of experience how I work with my clients, which is on that deeper level, looking for the root cause rather than just addressing the superficial, what you see on the surface.
You mean like functional medicine? Really?
Similar. I don't want to say devotee, but my mentor was Andrew Weil. And he's the grandfather of integrative medicine. So functional medicine also has made a name for itself too. We started first, I think.
Yeah, it did. Long ago.
Yeah.
But your 3 books and my 9.
Oh my goodness, I'm impressed with you.
Well, what's funny, that's part of that workaholic stuff I was talking about. I did a book a year since 2013 until here when I said, I ain't writing nothing this year. So.
Oh my goodness. The thought of doing another book, like I did 2 books in 2 years, and that almost killed me. I was like, I'm never doing this again.
Rough. People don't understand how hard it is. And I've got about 10 books in my head right now that I'm writing on various levels.
Wow.
My brain works. So
I admire you. I admire you.
they won't all come out, but they're all interesting to me. And childhood trauma is one of the things I want to write about. So when the time comes, I have another expert friend.
Yes, definitely. For sure. Yeah.
But thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's been really fun talking to you, Jimmy. I really appreciate you having me on.